What did the government almost get away with covering up? Story 1 in US v. Reynolds. Three widows sued the government in 1953 for the accident report on the airplane crash which ended their husbands. They claimed that the report would prove the crash was caused by negligent maintenance, entitling them to damages. The government claimed that the report could not be released because it contained sensitive military information. The court accepted this argument and refused to release the report. This is the origin and basis of the state secrets privilege. The report was finally declassified in 1996. It did prove that the government was negligent in maintaining the airplane and that the widows should have gotten their damages. It did not contain any sensitive military information. The entire basis of the state secrets privilege was nothing but a lie to screw some innocent civilians out of damages they were rightfully owed. Nonetheless, the SSP continues to be asserted and accepted in courts to this day. There's no telling how many of these assertions are yet more lies. Oh, sorry, this wasn't an almost got away with it story. They did get away with it and continue to do so. Story 2. The NSA spying on American citizens. I mean, they still do it anyway, but we know about it now. Boomer here. Cold War child. We always joked about Big Brother is watching, a purported condition in Soviet life, where government or other authorities were always observing and listening. You couldn't say anything anti-government or anti-ideology, or criticize the dear leader, even in your own private home, without risking your career or worse. Big Brother was the shorthand code word for what was bad about the Soviets and communism, and by extension, what was good about America. We all swallowed this and believed that our awareness and Americanness vaccinated us against all the propaganda. It could never happen here. Except guess what? It didn't vaccinate us at all. We have Big Brother in the form of smartphones, Alexis, online shopping, grocery membership cards. You name it, Big Bro is riding around in my purse. Not only rent-free, I freaking pay for it. And if I'm extra gullible, I'll enter a good clean copy of my fingerprints and a mugshot, just to make everybody's life simpler. Uh-oh, something got me started. Hushing now. Story 3, MK Ultra. The stuff they did to our own citizens was messed up, let alone the crap they did to the people they kept captive outside the US. In the case of MK Ultra, it was actually agents of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, FBN, the predecessor of the Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA. Agents of the FBN went on record in Douglas Valentine's The Strength of the Wolf. The truly shadiest shot was pulled off by the Department of Energy. They funded radioactive birth control pill studies, studies on radioactive gas releases on unsuspecting communities, and radiation exposure experiments to see if different races were more resistant. Story 4. If we're including the Army, I'm still a tad weirded out by the Pat Tillman situation. Was he deliberately murdered by Army higher-ups, or was it genuinely just another friendly fire? Spent time in the Army way back in the mid-70s, and if you think the Army higher-ups wouldn't murder or abandon a soldier to keep themselves from looking bad, have I got news for you. It was almost definitely friendly fire, but the government tried to cover it up. If you look at the big picture, the whole thing makes sense. First off, you have a guy who gives up a promising football career to enlist in the military during a time where enlistment is down. Not only does this guy enlist, but he becomes a member of an elite infantry unit. And just look at his picture. He's the epitome of a square-jawed superhero soldier. The guy was a walking recruitment poster. Him getting killed was unfortunate, but the admin can always turn someone into a martyr. That's a little harder if he was killed by his own people, though. Story 5, Santa Susana Field Lab. Had a massive sodium reactor meltdown in 1959. Was only discovered because a UCLA researcher found it buried in a report. The worst part is that because it was an experiment, the reactor wasn't shielded and blew radiation all over the place. And they're still fighting over who is responsible for the cleanup. Yep, my father-in-law was living off Keener when it melted down. I do think at a certain point, we need to accept a lower level of cleanup to get it started ASAP. I don't disagree that they should restore it to the highest level, but it also should have been handled a long time ago. A bird in the hand is worth two in the bush, and getting a decent level of cleanup soon is better than holding out for the highest level. That will reduce the amount leached into the watershed. Story 6, 500 broken treaties with the original people of this continent. The 500 broken treaties with the tribes, 567 federally recognized, the theft of Mount Rushmore and the Black Hills. All the coups started in Central America and recently in South America, and the overthrowing of governments for corporate gain and profits. just causing thousands of more indigenous people genocide. Monroe Doctrine, the theft of Hawaii. All this is documented, but to speak, the ugly truth is frowned upon. Story 7. There are likely some ungodly, dangerous bioweapons kept in a freezer somewhere. I'm talking about more dangerous than nukes Captain Trips level potential human extinction crap. For instance, a high-level Soviet defector has asserted in several books and publications that they crossed smallpox with Ebola. Oh, and they for sure messed up with myelin sheaths, created a form of Legionella that caused rapid onset paralysis reminiscent of multiple sclerosis. The insidious thing is that it apparently happens after you've cleared the infection, so there's no clue to medical professionals as to what's wrong with you. It was damn near 100% fatal in animal testing. That's just skimming the surface. Lots of research was done on super plague, the most virulent Y. pestis strains with diphtheria toxins genetically spliced in, then given antibiotic resistance. Story 8. So, back in 1959, have you ever heard of the Dyatlov Pass incident in Russia? A group of 9 experienced hikers set out on an expedition in the Ural Mountains, but none of them made it back. When search teams found their bodies, the scene was straight out of a horror movie. Some were found with missing eyes, one with a missing tongue, others with their skulls and chests crushed, yet no external wounds. Their tent was ripped open from the inside like they were fleeing something in total panic. Radiation was found on their clothes, and to this day, no one can fully explain what happened. The Soviet government quickly closed the case, blaming it on natural forces. But rumors started swirling about secret military tests, maybe even weapons experiments. And here's the kicker. When independent investigators tried to dig deeper, the authorities suddenly lost key documents. They almost buried the whole thing. Story 9, I read an Area 51 book, based largely on interviews from ex-employees there from back in the day. They talked a lot about the weird nuclear crap they did there, and a lot about the spy planes and secret programs, but the book got to a place where he wouldn't talk anymore about. He basically said, like, those human experiments the Germans were doing that were so horrific, like, we were doing that stuff too, but even now in my old age, I won't tell you about it. Every time the author brought it up, he was like, no, I don't even want to think about it. So that stuff never really saw the light of day. So I guess they did get away with it. It's like the moon landing. It would definitely have been easier to fake. I'm not sure either way, but Russia never called the US out about it because they were lying and faking stuff too. It would have just been a can of worms. Story 10 in the 1940s and 1950s, before we really knew about the repercussions and long-term effects of being exposed to radiation, the US government on Runit Island in the Pacific tested nuclear weapons. In the aftermath of the tests, they had men build a concrete dome over the craters of the detonations without being told what they were working on and lacked any protective equipment. All of the men that worked on that dome over the years have died from cancer and other illnesses relating to the radiation. The US government still denies these men died from being exposed to radiation and never compensated the families of the ones who have died. Story 11 in the UK, the post office scandal. I'm counting it as the government, as when it started, the Royal Mail and Post Office was nationalized and part of the same organization. During the period of the scandal happening, they were privatized and split into separate companies. For those not in the UK, a new computer system was introduced, which had errors in it, and hundreds of postmasters were convicted on criminal charges of theft and fraud, etc. For some of them doing significant jail time, as the computer system didn't calculate how much the post office store took correctly, and resulted in discrepancies to what was in the cash register. Story 12, with all the flavorful branding and whitewashing of trauma, the US DoD does and has provided funding for Agent Orange, Charlie Normandy, Patriot Act artichokes, Cult 45, ISIS, Marvel, etc. Is anyone surprised that they had a program known in the military for the source of all media, Fire from the Gods? They used this program across generations to describe what the future would look like. They've also used this apparatus to destabilize elections, murder civilians, and terrorize communities with the peak technology of the internet era, the ability to hear someone's thoughts through technology. This mark of the beast was pre-planned and widespread, with intention to force and live through an actual apocalyptic scenario, derived from the teenage media visionary and linked with Norse mythology for reference point. Story 13. The United States Department of Justice and the FBI are trying to pin the 2001 anthrax attacks on Dr. Bruce Ivins. He took his own life just prior to being officially charged in 2008, but not before he had undergone extensive covert surveillance and basically harassment by the U.S. Marshal Service and the FBI, not unlike the 1996 screw-up in the Summer Olympic Games in Atlanta, where the blame for the bombing was placed on Richard Jewell, who was later exonerated. Dr. Ivins was in the wrong place at the wrong time in his job at Fort Detrick in Frederick, Maryland. With so much egg on their faces following 9/11, several governmental agencies were determined to not be caught with their pants around their ankles. Dr. Ivins made a convenient scapegoat on which to pin the anthrax attacks. There's more, but I just hope the passage of time exonerates Dr. Ivins for the sake of his family. Much of the case is in the public domain, but much of it remains sealed and immune from freedom of information. FOIA requests. I would not want to be one of the useless bureaucrats who spend so much time and effort making their case stick to Dr. Ivins. Karma can be ruthless. Story 14, I'm convinced that our ICBM protection system is far more accurate than the Pentagon is willing to admit. Imagine you know that the ICBM protection system is, according to all your simulations, able to stop incoming warheads 96% of the time. You could make that value known to Congress, but you consider what horror lurks in that 4%. A strike of 60 or so Chinese ICBMs deploying 300 or so warheads and however many decoys. You could stop most of them, but 2 or 3 get through. 2 or 3 cities or bases get nuked. And that's, if you're right, everything you know, all the spycraft you've engaged in, every plan you bribed and stole says 96%. But what if you missed something? What if the eggheads did the numbers wrong? You couldn't test it, because if you did, the enemy would know. You know, a few of your own missiles have the extra effective defense penetrating system that you can't talk about because you can't even talk about the defense system it works against. Does your enemy have one too? And if you brag about how effective your defense system is, will they start developing one? Story 15. Carcinogenic chemicals associated with mass food production. My late wife and I both developed stage IV colon cancer before we hit 45, and the amount of other people who are in the same boat is staggering. So far, there's no definitive link between young onset colon cancer and any chemical that's part of the food manufacturing process, but it's hard to ignore how many people that grew up in the 80s and 90s now have late stage colon cancer. Edit, since this comment is popular. If you're reading this and you're worried about blood in your stools or narrow stools or cramps somewhere in your stomach that always appear in the same place, please see a doctor and try to get a colonoscopy or some stool analysis or something. Don't wait until you have to go to the ER. Story 16, NGAD and FAX are a lot farther along than they're letting on. Son of Blackbird is already doing active sorties. There are UAVs and UCAVs operating right now that are getting mistaken for UAPs because their flight profiles are so bizarre. The government is letting UFO conspiracy theories do the heavy lifting to keep anyone who might be trying to get information on them confused. Just saw an article about a stealth aircraft concept that doesn't have any control surfaces. Rudders and ailerons are one of the biggest challenges in keeping aircraft stealthy as they provide angled surfaces to reflect EM waves. The concept aircraft uses jets of high-pressure air from slots on the wings and tail to alter airflow along the vehicle's surface and affect maneuverability. An aircraft with this tech would look more and more like a simple triangle, which is a common shape for UAVs. Story 17, I have a very personal reason for wanting to know what they found at Roswell. My grandfather was in the Air Force and was present at the site. All he ever said about it wasn't a damn weather balloon, then shut down. He was low-ranking, basically just there to drive the higher-ranking personnel, but he saw something and I want to know what it was. He also firmly believed in aliens, so that just adds to my curiosity, especially given how Southern Baptist he was. Story 18. This was a good question. I guess I would answer that they are hiding a double standard. What I mean is, they talk about cutting services. Services that our tax dollars would pay for and have paid for, such as Social Security and Medicare. There's a very real discussion about raising the age of retirement. I've heard from the government economists, because I'm very much into economics, that it's impossible to fund a single-payer health insurance, which would cover every man, woman, and child getting free health care. But the upper tier of our government, such as Congress, the President, Supreme Court, etc., get these services for free. Even with the government shutdown that was looming and could be again coming up in 45 days, Congress, the President, and the courts are unaffected by any of that. They will still get paid. So why? Why did they get services? In fact, Their paychecks are not taxable. Think about that. Again, why? I thought we are a country of freedom and where everyone is equal. Story 19. Just how far the US went to destroy communism. The project to destroy communism is probably the largest single undertaking a nation state has ever embarked upon. It took nothing short than biblical amounts of wealth, manpower, energy, and control of much of the entire world as possible, and undermining the parts you could not control to even make this happen. We're all aware of the big sweeping policies that the Americans did to kill communism in the crib. The Bretton Woods Treaty, containment, the various wars they fought, the social policies, the Navy, the globalism, all of these things are quite literally the pillars of our modern society. And it was all primarily done for one reason only. If all the things we know about are literally not just era-defining events, but defining events in humanity's progression as a whole, just imagine what sort of no other stuff went under the radar. The only reason Europe is in the position they're in today is because the Americans looked at how much it would cost to rebuild it and said, is that less than communism? Okay, sign the check. All the NATO alliances originally started as essentially a bribe. Trillions of dollars was spent, and the lives of billions of people were altered to eliminate the communist threat. We may never see a national concerted effort to accomplish a single goal on this grand scale again. I really want to know the nitty-gritty. If it took nothing short of altering the world for a century, imagine how many stories and conspiracies are being hushed up in the name of that end. Story 20, Flight 93 was shot down by the military, and the heroes taking down the plane was propaganda to rally nationalism to support going to war. The flight was in the air well after we knew the towers were terrorist attacks. Flights had been grounded, and it was reported the plane was on a path for DC and not responding to traffic control. Fighter jets were already scrambled. The debris was spread over a large area with no crater. There were several reports on the day of and the aftermath, with eyewitnesses reporting seeing a fighter jet tailing a low-flying plane airliner. Then the hero story started and was never mentioned again. I'd actually be disappointed if the military didn't shoot it down. They had plenty of time to do so and knew what was happening at that point. And to allow it to go unchecked would be a major failure on the military's part. Story 21, that many shooters known to the FBI were armed, encouraged, radicalized, and very possibly blackmailed by FBI informants and agents. But they went off the reservation and killed people before the big bust happened. Or the authorities just declined to intervene, much like the ATF's big cartel gun-running op. Just ended up supplying guns to cartels with no actual gotcha at the end. They're constantly manufacturing fake Nazis and fake terrorists to arrest. Of course, they're doing the same with shooters. Problem is, the ammo you buy at the store is real. Whoops, looks like our guy popped off at Walmart ahead of schedule instead of going to the synagogue like we told him to. Story 22, and an employee of the US federal government. It's absolutely mundane. Every time someone brings up a conspiracy theory, I tell them, dude, work for the government. I can't think of a single person who could keep a secret for more than 5 seconds. I mean, pretty much everyone is overwhelmingly mediocre at their jobs. Government employment doesn't exactly attract the best and brightest. It pays okay, but the benefits are pretty good and it's really hard to get fired. Story 23, the FBI was complicit or entirely responsible for the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. They did so because they were unable to convince him to kill himself or ruin him with rumors about his affairs. The formation of the Rainbow Coalition was terrifying for government insiders, as it represented the possible dissolution of racism and classism, preventing the average American from attacking the power mostly concentrated in the hands of the wealthy. It also made them fear that an American socialist movement could quickly sweep the nation. Also, Hoover was blatantly hating. Story 24, True Impact of Triple Reactor Meltdown at Fukushima, Related Ecological Disaster, and Escalation of Cancer Risk. I'm not a scientist, but I am a lifelong nuclear energy and physics enthusiast. And the Fukushima disaster was something I followed and studied closely. The fact that 80% of the fallout went right into the ocean is a good thing, as far as nuclear disasters go. One of the reasons much of the U.S. nuclear weapons testing was done around the Marshall Islands was because of how little relative impact the testing would have been in the middle of the ocean. The bad effects mostly occurred at the time that the tests were conducted. Accidents mostly. These were mostly thermonuclear bombs, releasing far, far more energy and fallout than Fukushima. Water is a very good radiation shield, and ocean currents very quickly distribute the fallout materials. Initial energy released as radiation disperses immediately. It's a one-and-done thing. Fallout is all the physical matter that's unstable and decays radioactively. Dispersing it in the air and on land gives an easy path into many ecosystems and connected biomes. But in the ocean, the material is spread quickly into much lower concentration and mostly settles to the bottom, totally out of reach of anything above the water. In fact, despite so much of the fallout going into the ocean, the remaining fallout on land is what's doing all the damage. And even then, the number of people, mostly people who were in utero or born around the time of the disaster, is in the 10s and almost definitely below 100. Granted, the effects are tragic and horrible because it's almost always a terrible form of cancer, but still it will prove out to be relatively few people. Remember that most of the fallout escaped the reactor because seawater broke into the system, which then pulled most of it out into the ocean. By contrast, Chernobyl was so acutely bad because it was entirely on and underground, with prevailing winds carrying lots of fallout over a huge area of land. Story 25, The Truth of UFOs and UAP. It's been stigmatized and obfuscated for 70 plus years. I believe there are multiple facets at play. The truth is going to be ontologically shocking for the majority of the populace, and the government doesn't believe we're prepared to handle the truth. The technology, potentially zero-point or free energy, is so exotic and world-changing that it could threaten economic collapse. Similarly, the technology could possibly be exploited and abused by bad actors and enemies of the state. On that same note, they may not want us to know how much they've invested in and have used the technology to develop weapon systems and other military projects, which would lead to even further public distrust. It's clear at this point that the government has acknowledged the existence of UAP and that the phenomenon is indeed real, but they continue to avoid transparency and disclosure for fear of the outcome it may have on society. But it should not be their decision to make. We should be allowed to know the truth and be given the free will to deal with that truth however we may. It may break down the walls of some of our societal paradigms, but it may also help to unite us in ways we can't yet comprehend. As a moderator of r/UFOs, with millions of members and an ever-growing population, I think it's clear that people just want to know the truth and be allowed to make their own decisions. This topic is no longer niche and should no longer be stigmatized. It is the most important truth of our lifetime, and perhaps the most important and significant truth in humanity's history. We may not be alone, and the reality of their origin may be stranger and more incomprehensible than we could have imagined.